All right, well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Great Lakes Seminar, which is co-sponsored by SIGLR, the Cooperative Institute for Great Lakes Research, and NOAA's Great Lakes Environmental Lab. I'm Mike Schreiberg. I'm the director of the University of Michigan Water Center and a faculty member at the School for Environment and Sustainability. And I'm really pleased to introduce Adam Reimer. Adam was a colleague of mine when I previously worked at the National Wildlife Federation. And one of the things I appreciate perhaps most about Adam is, as you probably saw in the description, he's an applied social scientist. And to me, that means that, of course, he not only has a PhD, but that he works really hard and understands the on-the-ground implications and possibilities of potential environmental strategies. In his case, the application of this is largely in agriculture and specifically on protecting water quality. So he's got a really strong knowledge base there, connections, and a lot of what I'd say practical sensitivities that have really made him a leader on the human behavior side of that intersection, really important intersection of agriculture and environmental practices. So he's going to share a bit about his work and that of the National Wildlife Federation in this area. And I'd ask you, we're going to leave some time hopefully for questions at the end. The best way to do that is to put that into the question box, and then we will try and get to as many of them as we can. So thank you, Adam. Appreciate you being here, and I'll let you take it away.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Mike and team, for inviting me to speak today. I'm happy to be with you all. Um, so yeah, as Mike said, my background is in social and behavioral science. So I started out in kind of the natural resource field. My undergraduate degree is in wildlife. I did not come from a farming background, but I grew up in north central Indiana. So a lot of the natural resource issues in the Midwest and in Indiana are related to agricultural land uses, and so being interested in natural resources and conservation, that led me down a path of trying to learn about and better understand the role of agriculture and working landscapes. So I went on to do graduate work, where I was doing a lot of surveys and interviews and learning a lot from farmers and natural resource professionals about the role of conservation practices in farming operations, particularly in sort of the row crop dominated systems we have in the Midwest. And that was great. I enjoyed my time as a researcher, and went on to a postdoc here in Michigan, where I still live in Southwest Michigan. But then this opportunity came with National Wildlife Federation as part of their private land stewardship program, as they were sort of building out more support for outreach and engagement to help improve conservation outcomes. And it's a wonderful opportunity to do a lot of applied work, where I get to not only participate and help lead research on effective outreach and messaging strategies, but work with professionals and farmers who are trying to advance conservation and stewardship in agricultural landscapes, and help kind of apply lessons learned to make our work more effective. So what I'm going to share today is a little bit of our work at National Wildlife Federation and some of our efforts to apply these kind of behavioral and social science lessons, and then a couple of ongoing projects related to how innovative strategies, I would say, of how we better coordinate and engage with individual landowners and rural communities to advance water quality protection, wildlife, and just build resilience in these agricultural landscapes. So one of the central questions that or challenges that we see a lot when it comes to kind of on the ground outreach programming and engagement with producers is we have this sort of preaching to the choir challenge, where a lot of conservation professionals, whether it's folks with extension or with local conservation districts or federal or state agencies, they're holding events, conservation field days, workshops, trying to bring farmers together and demonstrate the value of these kinds of practices. But often the people who are showing up at those are the people who are already on board, right? The conservation-oriented farmers, those who already have experience using practices, and maybe even other conservation professionals, which is great. These are important audiences to engage with. But if we want to expand use of these practices and build things like soil health and climate resilience, we need to be reaching other audiences, people who aren't already using those practices, or people who might have other motivations or challenges. And so if we're only, through our engagement efforts, reaching people who are using practices, we may not be using the right strategies. And one of the things we kind of attribute this to, or that we see often, is there's this sort of dominant paradigm in conservation outreach or in science communications generally, and it's this what we call the information deficit model, right? So it's based on this mental model we have often of individuals as rational decision makers, and there's a lot of truth to that, right? And people are sort of weighing the costs and benefits of information they're taking in. But we know that knowledge and beliefs are often not the most important barrier to action, right? We often know that there are other things at play, things like attitudes or structural barriers to engaging in any practice. And this is not just true in agricultural context, right? I mean, there's a wide range of social and behavioral science that highlights this sort of intention to action gap, right? Sometimes we have the best intentions of acting on information that we have, but there can be things that get in the way. And there are other barriers as well that I'll kind of reference through here. But within this information deficit model, right, we know that just providing more information isn't always going to lead to a change in behavior. And particularly if we want to help provide information in an actionable way, we really need to target the outreach and information that we're giving to kind of the most relevant motivations or barriers of the audiences we're trying to reach. So we at NWF and others, kind of highlighted this challenge of preaching to the choir. And so we have a couple of approaches that have been designed to help kind of overcome this. And kind of the keystone one of these is our Grow More program. So this is a professional development training program primarily for conservation professionals. So this is a program that's really aimed at those who are working directly with farmers or with rural landowners or rural communities on conservation issues. And the program is really grounded in an understanding of social and behavioral science. So we introduce some basic frameworks or concepts from social science, and then messaging and communication strategies to help us better achieve our conservation goals by reaching new audiences or those that we've had a difficult time engaging. I'm going to spend a little bit of time kind of going through some of our approaches that we use in this program and some of the insights that we've learned since 2019, which is about when I came on board with NWF. So since the program started, we've trained, I think this is actually closer to 1,000 people at this point. We've done, I think we're approaching 100, or we're over 100 workshops now that we've done for folks. This is it's a slightly outdated map, but it kind of shows you the spread. So we really kind of developed this program, particularly in the Midwest and the Great Lakes states, but we've since expanded to a number of other regions of the country. And the guidance we're providing is going to shift a little bit depending on the context, right? Because agriculture in the Midwest is different from, in the Southeast or in, South Dakota or New England. And so we kind of shift or tweak some of the examples, but the concepts that we're getting across, right? People are people wherever they're at. And so a lot of the lessons are apply in a lot of different contexts. One of the things that we really have recognized early on when we were developing this program is that, the folks who are working in conservation fields or natural resource fields, they have a lot of background in natural sciences or applied natural sciences, things like soil science and agronomy, the kinds of technical skills that are really important as they're providing technical assistance to producers. I should mention that this graph comes from a or chart comes from a conservation practitioner poll that was conducted in the Midwest a few years back, where they were asking conservation professionals what kinds of training and background they have, among other questions. But I think this is revealing that if we look down at the bottom of this chart, these sort of what we might think of as softer skills, but training related to marketing or sales, psychology, rural sociology, which are really kind of key skills that practitioners need if they're going to be conducting outreach or working with audiences in a sort of motivational or persuasive context. These are really important, but they may have less formal training in these areas. And so the Grow More program is really an opportunity to provide some of that training to folks and hopefully share some strategies or lessons learned that can help us kind of shift this information deficit model. So again, this is just a kind of graphical representation of this information deficit model. It's a very simplistic model of sort of decision making, where knowledge and awareness of practices or behaviors leads to individuals having the skills and abilities, which is going to lead to behavior change. And so the role of outreach is really, again, providing that basic information and maybe helping develop those skills. And again, this is not to say these aren't important, but we think that this model is overly simplistic and doesn't necessarily allow professionals to be maximally effective in how they're providing information. So without going into too much depth into kind of the theoretical basis, this is a one decision-making model. It's got a couple of different names, but it's adapted from the kind of theory of reasoned action, or the theory of planned behavior, which folks might be familiar with. But it really says that, at its core, these kind of intentional behaviors, things like adopting cover crops, or implementing a new nutrient management strategy, or other conservation practices we can think of in agricultural landscapes, are very intentional behaviors. People take time to think through and make these decisions very conscientiously, and that those kinds of decisions are influenced by kind of three main factors, right? So attitudes towards the behavior, whether it's going to be good, people believe it's going to be good or bad for them if they apply the practice. Social norms, right? People are influenced by what others are doing, right? People are often uncomfortable being too outside the norm, or they want to take advantage of what lessons other people have learned. Also, a component of that is sort of more of a normative component, in that, like, people want to be seen as upstanding citizens and doing the right thing, right? So there's sort of a values component to that. And then self-efficacy, right? Whether people have the right skills or ability or decision-making authority to be able to successfully implement a practice, right? And all of these are influenced by a variety of beliefs, which are in turn influenced by the information people have at hand, although filtered through a variety of kind of psychological frameworks that people have in their mind that can kind of influence how they're perceiving or taking in information. So again, this is a complicated model. This is a very simplistic way to present that, but it's a way to kind of complicate a little bit that decision-making process, and to help us as conservation professionals better understand, maybe for a particular audience, what the barrier might be, right? So it's very contextual. So for one producer for a given practice, it might be a sort of negative attitude towards a practice. Maybe they've heard that the practice isn't very effective, or that might have too many challenges. For others, it might be a social norm aspect, right? Maybe they just don't see others in their area using a practice, and they don't consider it sort of part of like standard good farming practices, right? So by being able to better understand our audience and what's getting in the way of them using these practices, we can better target outreach and technical assistance to motivate that particular audience. So we can kind of think of these as like levers of behavior change. So the better we have a sense of who our audience is and what their challenges are, the more targeted and hopefully effective we can be. And so again, this is sort of a slightly more complicated model of decision making, but it allows us as conservation professionals to better target what's really going on. So not just providing knowledge and awareness, but also being able to shift or kind of pull those levers of behavior change depending on who we're trying to reach. So this is one of the models that we introduced through our Grow More program. It's a modular training program. So we usually do these in like a 1 or 2 day workshop with groups of conservation professionals, and we start with those kind of behavior change basics, introducing some of the concepts I've already been talking about. We talk about the role of culture and social norms, and then get into kind of messaging and outreach strategies, right? So how can we, based on once we have this understanding of maybe what how people are making decisions and what's going on in people's heads, how we can better utilize messaging or framing techniques to better meet our audience where they're at and to provide information that's actionable and relevant to their context. And then we apply those in this workshop through kind of planning and evaluation and some strategies for how to kind of practically implement these in the kinds of outreach programming that the agencies and individuals are already doing. So we've, I guess one of the other main models that we utilize in this, which we think is helpful for folks to better understand, these prime sort of what we think of as middle adopter audiences that folks are trying to reach, is the diffusion of innovations theory, which folks might be familiar with. And I think this the terminology of like early adopters, middle adopters, largely comes from this theory. But it's really it's a very complex set of kind of principles that really describes, and I think why we find it effective is it describes the process of how new ideas become mainstream, right? Because even though people are different and people have different kinds of motivations or barriers, there's sort of this predictable pattern if we look at a kind of a group level or population level about how new ideas become common or acceptable. And particularly this diffusion of innovations curve that's on the screen here kind of describes this regular process in terms of like segments of populations, right? So at the beginning of an innovative process or when a new idea is coming in, we have this group of innovators who are the ones kind of applying or tinkering around. They're the ones kind of leading the edge of applying that idea or that behavior in their context. But it's a very small group of people who are doing that. And they're followed by the early adopters. So these are people who, by personality or circumstance, are very open to change, right? These are folks who are always kind of looking for what's new. They're very willing and open to new ideas and new practices. They kind of like standing out from their peers maybe a little bit. In the middle, we have kind of this early and late majority, which are often kind of lumped together as this like middle adopter group, right? And these are people who are much more kind of status quo biased, who have, and I'll go into some of the particular challenges we kind of see with this audience. But these are the kind of the targets of, or I think who we believe really should be the targets of outreach, right? Because oftentimes when we're looking at conservation practices, whether it's soil health practices like no-till or cover crops, or precision agriculture approaches, we often are kind of at this like 10 to 15% adoption range, depending on where we're at. And we think there's a lot of good evidence that that's because the outreach approaches we're taking that are very kind of information heavy, that are really focused on providing the most recent science, emphasizing sort of the newness or novelty of these practices, or focusing on the conservation benefits, is really well targeted towards those innovators and early adopters. It may not be as well suited to reaching those middle adopters. And so we need a shift in strategy if we're going to be effective at kind of getting, crossing that gap between the early adopters and the middle adopters. Finally, I should reference in this model, there is at the tail end who we might call, resistors. There are various terms that people will use. And these are folks who are less open to change, or maybe by again, circumstance, maybe less able to take on new practices or take on risky changes. And they're sort of the last group to come on board. And we tend to not have as much guidance towards reaching them, partially because, again, this curve really represents a process, right? We sort of need to get early adopters on board and then shift to getting the middle adopters on board to build more of that kind of social norm around these kinds of practices. And that's kind of the strategy then for bringing in resistors. So it's sort of a sequential model in that sense. So as I said, this is one of the main approaches we take in the Grow More program, where we're helping people understand maybe what the motivations of those middle adopters are and how we need to shift outreach or messaging approaches. So the next few slides are going to be, from our Grow More curriculum that we share. I'm going to kind of scratch the surface a little bit of these because, like I said, these are usually 1 or 2 day workshops, but just to give you a sense of the kinds of approaches we see success in. Is again describing the mental models of these different groups. So those early adopters and innovators, are more open to new ideas. They're sort of accepting of challenges or temporary failures, right? They see it kind of as part of the inherent part of trying something new, and they see it as opportunities to demonstrate success, right, by overcoming challenges. They tend to be open to kind of using longer timeframes to evaluate options. And they're more independent in the sense that they are, as I said, more willing to kind of stand out from others. They take pride in being innovators or early adopters, and not necessarily doing what their neighbors are doing. Kind of on the flip side, those sort of middle adopter group just are generally a little more uncomfortable with new ideas that challenge their existing thinking, right? That idea of sort of status quo bias. Which we're all status quo biased as people. That's sort of an adaptive strategy that we have, but for some, it's that carries a little more weight. They tend to take failure personally, or they are less willing to put themselves in positions where they might they might fail or might have challenges. And in part, that's because of, again, where they fall in the sequence, right? If they have neighbors, early adopters who are successfully using that practice and they see that success, they if they run into challenges, they're more likely to think it's something they did wrong rather as part of the an inherent part of the process, right? And so they may need more of that kind of ongoing technical assistance or connection with peers who are using practices. Again, they sort of need more support to be able to kind of overcome challenges or troubleshoot problems as they happen. They want to see early successes, right? So they're using shorter time frames to assess success of practices, which can be a challenge with things like cover crops that may take several years to really kind of see tangible benefits in terms of like changed soil properties or soil health metrics. And they are more socially influenced, right? So they're more likely to be kind of influenced by this neighbor effect, right? They're less willing to like put themselves out on a limb, perhaps, with new practices if they don't see others doing it. Or they may have more concerns about being judged by neighbors or landowners or peer farmers. And so again, that really emphasizes the need for more peer support and focusing on building those positive social norms. So then after we kind of introduce this model and talk through how to kind of identify kind of where the folks they're working with are at within this adoption framework, we introduce kind of these strategies or messaging approaches that we can better use, they're better suited to reaching those middle adopters. And we spend quite a bit of time kind of going through these, and I'm just, I'll kind of introduce them here today. But right, it's about really providing the right motivation, is like speaking to what motivates them. And, for middle adopters, it may not be the conservation benefits directly, right? Maybe there are other kinds of operational benefits that they are more motivated by, whether it's, reducing risk in their operation or, meeting some other like supply chain sustainability or, marketing outcome. So we kind of go into what some of those motivations might be that would better reach those kinds of middle adopters. It's a lot of practical advice around speaking your audience's language, using terminology that's going to resonate more with middle adopters or people who aren't as into innovative or new practices. Really focusing on how conservation solves practical problems on the farm. Again, that's a way to kind of approach conservation as having like direct on-farm benefits for producers and not just focusing on the maybe water quality benefits that might be there as well. Framing the conversation by kind of contextualizing risk, right? So especially for middle adopters, the idea of change can be risky or seem scary, and new practices of course carry risk, but oftentimes we as people tend to overweight the risk of doing something new, and we kind of take for granted the known risks of things we're doing now. And so there are some strategies we provide for how to kind of put this in better context, right? That like all practices carry risk, and it's really a matter of balancing kind of a portfolio of risk as opposed to just avoiding the risk of something new. Making it safe for change. That's where we kind of bring in more of that kind of social influence, right? Is like building that idea of positive social norms, trying to tap into more deeply held values that producers may have, whether it's around stewardship broadly, or community or legacy impacts, right? Wanting to leave the farm better off for the next generation. And then some strategies for providing clear steps, right? So not overwhelming people with information, really focusing on how to make things actionable and accessible for producers. And then again, we focus on some kind of messaging strategies. I've already referenced several of these, so I won't kind of go into too much depth on these, but things like focusing on the problems that conservation is solving for an operation that may not be related to off-farm water quality benefits. It may be focusing on the pest management or nutrient management components that benefits that practices have, or the ability to kind of manage seasonality of like field access, particularly with climate change and kind of changing weather patterns that farmers are experiencing. There are ways that conservation can help kind of overcome some of those problems. Managing kind of risk on farm, meeting supply chain sustainability efforts that are out there, but also appealing to things like personal or industry reputation, stewardship, or even explicit religious values that people have, or again speaking to those legacy components. And I'll mention too that as we were beginning this program, we were grounding this in not only the existing research but also working with researchers to better identify like what are those motivations that middle adopters have. So we worked with Dr. Robin Wilson at the Ohio State University, who's one of the kind of leading researchers on conservation motivations. And so a lot of the lessons I've been talking about over these last few slides reflect both kind of research findings as well as like what we've seen over the years of being effective strategies that folks have used. We also, continually evaluate the program, to try to see which, not only to evaluate kind of the learning outcomes that we have or the skill building outcomes among participants, but also to identify like how effective are these strategies. And we've definitely tweaked the program over the years based on the feedback we've seen from folks as they implement new strategies. So I'm just going to share just a few kind of insights from some of our evaluation work over the years. And I should say these are mostly based on surveys with participants where we follow up with people a few months after they've gone through a training, not only to see what they took away from it, but also what they've done differently. So we see sort of a moderate amount of impact, a moderate to a lot of impact on how folks are conducting conservation outreach, which we take, we of course love to see, a great deal of impact, but we also recognize, this is a one-day workshop. This is in some ways the beginning of a process for many folks in thinking differently about how to approach outreach and how to structure things. So this is a way to say that, I'll add that we're continuing to kind of build on the Grow More model and provide additional support and resources for folks. In terms of the kind of impact of the specific kind of topics or modules that we present, we see a lot of impact of the practical lessons, right? The behavior change basics are important. That's the foundation that we build on, but it's really, again, the practical framing and outreach strategies that we're providing that seem to have the most impact for how natural resource professionals are going about outreach. And then, again, we want to assess and use the folks we're working with to better understand which of these kind of messaging or framing strategies are most effective. So it's kind of a complicated graph, but if you look at the green and blue bars would kind of reflect the strategies that these professionals see the most benefit in trying out, right? And that's sort of those practical kind of problem solving approaches seem to be the most resonant, as well as tapping into legacy values. as well. I'll let you read the others, but some are. The idea here is some are more effective than others, but all of these strategies could be effective with certain segments of the audience, right? So one of the big kind of takeaways from the Grow More training is that we're really advocating better understanding your specific audience and really doing more work to target conservation outreach to meet those audiences kind of where they're at, and to match the messaging to the particular motivation. So it's sort of an all of the above strategy in many ways. So as I said, we also recognize that there are other kinds of approaches that are valuable as well, and maybe this is connected a little bit to that role, the important role of social norms and peer support, particularly from middle adopters. So we've seen a lot of growth and recognition in the kind of conservation field of the importance of conservation or peer-to-peer approaches, right? Network-based approaches to outreach and engagement and connecting producers with each other. We've done some of that through our Conservation Champions program, where we work with farmers to promote or to better promote conservation practices among their peers and in their kind of local networks. So what I'm going to share here is a small study we did a few years ago to kind of better identify where these networks are at within the Great Lakes region. So we had some funding from the Great Lakes Protection Fund to do sort of a network inventory, but also to better understand like what are networks doing? Like how are organizations or peer groups like approaching conservation outreach? How are they utilizing peer-to-peer approaches to advance conservation outcomes, or what kinds of conservation outcomes are they focused on? So I'm going to share a few insights from this study, which we conducted in 2022 and 2023. There's a lot more information available. We have a report on our website, which I'll share the link to at the end of this presentation if you want more information. But just to share a few of the highlights, because I think this is, again, really important that we recognize, or the conservation community really recognizes the importance of peer networks, but there really is not like an existing database of where these exist, or again, even really an understanding of where all of these networks are at, or what they're doing, or what they're accomplishing. And so this was in part a way to kind of start to build that evidence base. So we used kind of a multi-stage process. We did some initial kind of peer interviews or key informant interviews to kind of scope out this work and kind of get at the idea of like, how do we define networks? How do we best approach how to identify these? We did 2 rounds of surveys. So we also actually mentioned did some kind of internet research, right? Just like Googling and internet scraping to kind of identify where networks might be at. And that was used to inform a couple of rounds of surveys. So first we surveyed conservation organizations. So these were everything from conservation districts to extension networks to state agencies or nonprofits that are engaged in conservation work across the Great Lakes states. And we were asking about where networks are at, if they know where peer networks exist, and some questions about what they were doing. That was used to then identify a set of networks or peer-to-peer organizations, and then we surveyed those organizations as well to better understand what their goals are, what kinds of strategies they're using. So again, this is a few years back. So in this first round of surveys, so these were online surveys that we administered through the Qualtrics platform. We ended up surveying over 700 organizations across all of the Great Lakes states. We got responses from about 130, which is the highest response rate, but I think gave us a good representation across the wider basin, and helped us, like I said, identify these networks. Then again, as I said, we then surveyed those networks directly based on the contacts that we had for those. And got a smaller set of responses, but I think those are really valuable at better understanding how networks themselves are approaching outreach or peer support. So we ended up identifying over 200 farmer networks or supporting organizations. Now, I will say one of the kind of biggest lessons learned for us through this process is the real inherent challenge at defining what is a farmer network, right? Because we ended up, among this 200 plus groups, there was a strong subset that were what we ended up terming farmer-centered networks, right? So these were organizations that were primarily focused on bringing farmers together. They often had direct farmer leadership, but not always. Sometimes they were being led by a conservation district or an extension professional that was providing that sort of leadership and facilitation, with various levels of farmer leadership. But some of these were agencies that were doing a lot of network-based outreach, not necessarily with a strong farmer leadership component, whether that was through public agencies, through private organizations. And then there were also drawing boundaries around what is a conservation-focused farmer network was often quite tricky as well, because there are many kind of state-level organizations or regional organizations that have a conservation portfolio, but may not be solely focused on conservation. So, again, there was a lot of variation, I think, was the biggest takeaway. This is a map that just shows kind of where the networks were at. Wisconsin had by far the largest concentration, which we really attributed to the existence of a state-level program through their State Department of Ag that directly supports farmer-led watershed groups that are doing conservation outreach. And that program's been around for about a decade now, and it's led to a large number of these groups that are really farmer-centered, farmer-led, maybe with support from other organizations, but definitely the highest concentration. And I guess one of the last insights from this study that I'll share is, again, that networks focus on a variety of different things. They're often less focused on particular practices and more focused on, I think, what we can think of as broader outcomes, right? Whether it's soil health was a big cross theme across networks. To a smaller extent, water quality might be a focus. That was a particular emphasis in Wisconsin through their state-led program. But also things like rotational grazing or these more systems-based approaches that have not only conservation benefits, but also some direct benefits to producers themselves. And the networks were using a wide range of activities, right? Doing everything from field training or field days to trainings, but also things like mentorship or contributing to on-farm or network-based research. So again, a lot of variety across these networks. And then briefly, there was variation from state to state too. So there's regionality within this, just in terms of what the particular focus of the organization is or how they're structured, right? So for instance, Indiana didn't have we didn't identify as many locally led organizations, but there's a really strong kind of state-based network of conservation partners in Indiana that's doing a lot of work across the state, right, and connecting producers, in different parts of the state. So maybe a different approach. Not so the presence, the fewer networks there doesn't necessarily mean they're less effective than those in Wisconsin. It's just a different approach. So there were a lot of, I think we generated some good insights from this study, but it, of course, unveiled a range of other research questions that we still have, and there's been some good research that's come out recently as well from others that have shown some of the impacts in states like Iowa or Wisconsin of some of these peer networks or demonstration networks, things like that. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about briefly is some of our ongoing work here in the state of Michigan. So we've been working increasingly over the last few years to support conservation efforts, particularly in the eastern part of the state, focused on water quality, especially in the Lake Erie Basin there in southeast Michigan. But also thinking about how we can better support soil health outcomes or wildlife conservation through the state. We have a current project that we're working on in partnership with the conservation districts in the state, so the State Association of Conservation Districts. And this project work is supported by the Michigan Department of Ag. And there are a couple of components to this, but one of the things we're really trying to do is by working with districts to identify effective strategies for engaging agricultural producers, right? Michigan's a very diverse state in terms of agriculture and climate and, the sort of biophysical setting. And so there's a lot of variation in approaches that folks have taken. And I think there are lessons learned that we're hoping to help kind of spread across the state or beyond. And also thinking about capacity building and outreach support. So again, one of the underlying kind of premises of all of this work is that a lot of conservation progress is made relationally, right? It's farmers working with other farmers. It's farmers working with their local conservation professionals to implement and have success with practices. And those are really based on these like trust-based relationships that they're developed over time. But that takes capacity, right? And it takes a training and a mindset and an activity level at the local level that's really important. And so we're working on identifying opportunities to help build capacity at the local level and support outreach efforts that have that are effective. And then one of the components of that too is to provide some strategic planning and evaluation. How do we identify which of these strategies are most effective, and do that in a rigorous way so that we can disseminate best practices. So one of the efforts kind of in that last front, we've been working with some of the conservation districts and other partners in the southeast part of the state to identify what are the intermediate outcomes that we need? How can we develop sort of a holistic strategy or roadmap of the outcomes that we need to achieve the large scale conservation goals that we have, right? And so through a planning process a few years ago that we're now continuing this year, we worked with folks to kind of identify and work backward from like, what are the biggest impacts we want to see, right? So we kind of started with this main goal, this main sort of organizing principle in the southeast part of the state, where we want to improve water quality in Lake Erie, right? We have significant water quality impairments, hazardous algal blooms, largely related to phosphorus in the water systems, partially due to agricultural practices. And so if that's the impact we want to see, how do we get there, right? And the sort of key long-term strategy is that like we need adoption of key conservation practices, right? Things like reduced tillage or improved nutrient management or edge of field practices that help keep nutrients in the field and keep them from getting into the waterways. But again, we're operating in a largely voluntary adoption system, right? So this requires a lot of voluntary action by producers. And there are a variety of programs that exist, but we need farmers to be actively engaging in those, right? Seeking information, wanting to participate in, or enroll in programs in order to then apply practices that are going to reduce water quality impacts. And then in the short term, and again, there were many. This is an example, a very streamlined example, but one of the ways we do that is by increasing producer trust in local conservation professionals or agencies, right? So we need to build those relationships first in order to have that trust that farmers might need to want to apply for a program or engage in a conservation effort. So this is an example of kind of a planning process we undertook to help identify what are the range of outcomes that we need. And there were kind of 6 key ones that we identified through this process. So one is just improving the outreach and technical skills of conservation specialists, right? Like we need them to be essentially worthy of the trust that farmers place in them by building skills. Particularly at the conservation district level, we see a lot of turnover, a lot of early career professionals, which is great because they bring in enthusiasm and kind of fresh training, but they may need additional, practical technical skills or the kinds of outreach training or message training that we, apply through like our Grow More program. Second, we need to increase kind of active outreach and engagement with farmers, not just education about BMPs, but also like really, kind of a collaborative planning process to think about broad goals and not just focusing on specific practices. Again, the idea of targeting really came up through this, right? Is that like we need to not just be reaching the same farmers that we always work with, but also increasing connections with those middle adopters, folks who are not currently using practices. Increased awareness of water quality issues in general or conservation needs was seen as as one important short-term outcome. Focusing on the peer-to-peer approach, there is a kind of a long-standing farmer-led group in the area that that may have has seen some sort of drop off or is in need of some reinvigoration, right? Some new leadership, maybe some new approaches to that, and there are some current efforts underway to help do that. I think are really exciting. As well as, ultimately, again, some of these are leading to this increased farmer participation in programs and ongoing projects. So these are the outcomes. These aren't necessarily the strategies we identified. There's a lot on this slide. I apologize for kind of throwing up a bunch of text. Really, I think the focus here is like the sort of model that we were building through this is to first identify what are those outcomes, and then how do we prioritize or sequence strategies to help us achieve that, right? So like that kind of first stage, if you look from left to right, it's improving training or building up that local technical capacity, doing more of that innovative outreach that are then going to help us, engage new audiences to kind of broaden the communication and engagement approaches that are going to help us achieve these outcomes. So again, the idea here is that we're building a strategy, not just for the conservation districts, but also for other partners, right? So that we have a shared idea of what that change process looks like and what strategies we want to be utilizing to do that. So sort of the next steps, or what we're working on now, we're working with, again, conservation districts and other partners, including the Michigan Department of Ag, to develop sort of a theory of change roadmap. So we're in the process of doing that right now. We did a survey of conservation professionals and some collaborative workshop planning, and I should mention too, I didn't put their logo on here, but in partnership with the University of Michigan Water Center is our partner on this to help identify some of these important intermediate outcomes, and then really develop this aligned strategies, right? So that each organization, whether it's MSU Extension or conservation districts or the State Department of Ag, are best utilizing their tools and programs in again an aligned way, and that the messaging lines up, and that farmers and landowners are hearing a coordinated, cohesive message, right? So that we're better reaching the audiences we need to be reaching. And then finally, by identifying what are those outcomes that we're trying to achieve and what strategies are we trying to employ, that we can develop sort of a robust evaluation system so that we can better identify what strategies are successful, and really applying this kind of adaptive management mindset where if one strategy we're trying and it's not really working, that we have the evidence to see that and be able to pivot and try something different. So we're really hopeful that this will help better utilize the programs and technical capacity that currently exists, to better align these programs with the needs of farmers and landowners in the region to achieve shared outcomes. Again, really, kind of the organizing principle here is improving water quality, but I think there are a lot of additional benefits, including just farmer well-being or improved kind of social connections among producers in this region, or better connections between rural and urban communities as well. So a lot of opportunities in this space, and we're really excited to be help play a part in it. So that's what I wanted to share today. Again, I put my contact information here. Also, our program website has a lot of additional resources on it. There should be a tab there that has additional reports or things that we've done over the years. That Connecting Conservation Network report is there, as well as some other resources. And then on a practical level, there's an outreach toolkit that we've developed over time that kind of builds on the Grow More training, but that's also available for other kinds of professionals. It has, other examples of conservation messaging approaches or things that people have seen success with, as well as kind of planning and evaluation resources. So, please do avail yourself of that if it's of interest at our website, and the URL or the QR code should lead to that as well. So with that, thank you, everybody, and hopefully we've got some time for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Really, really interesting presentation. encourage folks, if you have questions, please put them into the question function on here. And let me start with one from Ann Hansen. I'm going to read this one fully because it's very interesting. It says, our family has been passed on to my siblings and me. It's only 50 acres, and we want to protect the land as farmland for as long as possible. She thinks of it as a farmland conservancy. Um, all that said, we're operating the farm at a loss, and we expect that to be the case throughout our ownership. And she's created an LLC for the farmland. So the question is, are there options that you're discussing that would help achieve the goals of protecting the land and preserve control over the farm financially? So how do you strike that balance?
Yeah, it's a good question. I will caveat all of this by saying I'm not necessarily an expert on existing programs. I have a good passing familiarity with them, but I think there are a number of farmland protection and easement programs that exist that could provide some additional tax benefits or payments potentially. I think this, it is a larger question though, right? Is that like farms need to be sustainable from an economic perspective to continue on, right? So the economic value of conservation is an important component, and it's something that is important to recognize. I think a lot of the practices that we talk about, whether it's kind of under this umbrella of soil health practices, have a lot of benefits on the economic bottom line in terms of improving soil health, reducing need for external inputs that can have really tangible impacts over time. There is an establishment period that may not necessarily pay off from a return on investment perspective, but some of those practices can be really valuable, and there are cost share programs that exist to help through that kind of transitional period. So those are definitely worth looking into. I think again, the local conservation district is like the best kind of first entry point. The professionals there should definitely be able to provide a sense of what resources are available.
Thank you. Yeah, ask you one that's come up a lot that I've seen, which is, can you dig a little deeper into the messenger issues? Because it seems like a lot of this work is with the conservation districts who are a messenger, but we know the best messengers tend to be peer to peer. People that yet, those might not be the early adopters or even the middle adopters. So can you talk? And I know you had bits of this, but I'd love for you to dig down a little bit into that messenger issue that I think a lot of us wrestle with.
Yeah, it's a really important component, right? Because the message itself is important, but the messenger is just as important, and maybe sometimes even more important. Or the intersection of those two is key. I think, a couple of quick takeaways. Yeah, peer to peer is incredibly important, and having the right farmer messenger is really key. I think early adopters and innovators can be powerful spokespeople or influencers, but they also have to speak the right language, right? They have to approach it not necessarily in what motivates them as an early adopter, but what might motivate their audience, who might just have different values or goals. So that's one important component. Another is having private sector advisors, echoing some of these conservation messages is also really important, right? We know, particularly in kind of row crop commodity agriculture, farmers are increasingly, relying on guidance from agronomists or retailers. And there's been a lot of work in other parts of the Midwest. Iowa really comes to mind at building up this idea of like conservation agronomy, having private sector, employed through co-ops or independent advisors who are providing targeted technical assistance around the technical components of practice adoption. And that's really key as well. So I think sometimes in the conservation world, maybe sometimes our best outreach venue is not with farmers directly, but it's also working with retailers or private advisors to help promote the conservation benefits and help provide them the messages that they need to be effective spokespeople with farmers.
Interesting. And then kind of a follow on from that. See, a lot of the folks on this call, and at least the hosts are the scientists that are coming up with more information for best practices and a lot of the data on that. Do you have any advice or insights into sort of getting from the data generation into practice, how that gap is best breached, or what in your experience has been really effective with that?
Yeah, there's a lot there. And that, yeah, it's a good question. I think one of the key, I'm going to go back to sort of that information deficit model, right? Is that like keeping in mind as a scientist or as a science communicator, like being very clear about what your goal is. Maybe the goal is just to provide the most current science. Maybe it's to provide it in a way that is persuasive or motivating, and those are slightly different goals, right? That take a different communication approach. So at the beginning of any kind of communication opportunity, it's really clear. It's important to be clear about what you're trying to accomplish, and then developing the strategies that um, that are most appropriate. I think the other component of that is, I think especially we've seen a real breakdown in sort of trust and expertise and reliance on expertise generally, right? And so I think it's really important to take more of a maybe a listen first approach and better understanding who your audience is, or trying to better understand who your audience is and where they're coming from before providing information. And so it's more of a collaborative model of communication where we're trying to best understand our audience first, and then identifying what the information that most aligns with the goals or motivations of our audiences.
Makes sense. Well, thanks. I think we're going to leave it right there. There are a couple people with really specific questions and about resources, and I encourage you to reach out directly to Adam. You've got his email right on that sheet there, and so for those things, I would encourage you to reach out directly. But I want to thank Adam for taking his time and for his long work in this area and ability to explain, I think, this really complex sort of behavioral interplay in a really clear way. So you can see why his work's been so effective. And thanks everybody for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again.
Thanks, everyone. We'll be ending the webinar now.